A funny thing happened on the way to the hospital. From the fall of 1976 through the spring of 1979, I enjoyed 3 of the most carefree years of my life while I attended the School of Music at Florida State University as a graduate assistant in choral music education. During that time, there were nearly endless opportunities to experience some of the finest artistic occasions in America. One of the highlights of the years at FSU included a combined concert performance of Mahler's Eighth Symphony, the Symphony of 1,000, with the Florida State University Singers, the Ohio State University Choirs, and the Atlanta Symphony Orchestra and Chorus under the baton of Maestro Robert Shaw. The crowning, glorious concert inspired me to seek employment in the Atlanta area upon graduation from FSU. The closest teaching position I could locate near Atlanta was 90 miles north in Dalton. The fall of 1979 started out wonderfully. There was a large and talented chorus at Dalton High School who had established a tradition of fine performances. In addition, I was accepted by audition as a tenor in the Atlanta Symphony Orchestra Chorus and the chamber choir. To have the opportunity to work regularly under Mr. Shaw's direction in perhaps the finest chorus in America was my greatest dream come true. The school chorus set an ambitious schedule in the fall. In addition to my full-time teaching responsibilities, I had weekly rehearsals and church services with my church choir. Of course, there was every Monday night's trip to Atlanta for rehearsals with the ASOC. Mondays were particularly busy, beginning with the 5:30 a.m. clock radio, 7 a.m. first period chorus class, and the dismissal from school around 2:30. That left enough time to relax a few minutes at home before driving the 90 miles to Atlanta for the 7:30 p.m. rehearsal. At 10 o'clock, Mr. Shaw would dismiss us for the return to the real world. Around midnight, I would arrive at my small garage apartment, having unwound from the exhilarating rehearsal. Performance weeks in Atlanta were especially difficult for a commuting member of the chorus. A young person can keep up with the abuse of missing one night's rest, but performance weeks test the endurance of the strongest musicians. The schedule includes Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday night rehearsals, then Thursday, Friday, and Saturday night performances, with occasional recording sessions on Saturday and Sunday afternoons. That schedule takes its toll after a while. I logged over 5,000 miles to Atlanta that season. As December neared an end and all the performances were concluding, I began to notice my fatigue level was unusually high. Fortunately, the Christmas vacation was just ahead, and I knew I could catch up on my rest during the 2 weeks away from school. Each morning, I felt that I was more tired and weak than when I had gone to bed. The strength required to merely rise up from my bed was noticeably slipping. I had to first push up on my elbows, then rise to the sitting position, and at that point, I could get up slowly and walk around the house. New Year's Eve arrived, and my buddy Carl from Atlanta and his girlfriend were coming to visit and celebrate the New Year. About 8:30 p.m., I was exhausted and decided to go on to bed. I remember being quite restless, but I was much too tired and weak to stay out of bed. The next morning, Carl and I went out to find some breakfast at a local restaurant. By that time, I was having difficulty walking and often put my hand on Carl's shoulder for balance and strength. The next evening, I had a date with a friend from church to take in a movie. In that 24-hour period, I had lost additional strength and was only able to walk securely if I leaned on my date's shoulder. My steps were now reduced to a 12-inch stride. What seems humorous in retrospect was our trying to cross Brainerd Road, a 6-lane traffic artery, Saturday night on foot without the aid of a traffic signal. Fortunately, a policeman turned on his blue lights, stopping traffic while we concluded our crossing. A couple of days later, it was time to return to teaching duties at the high school. My strength and stamina were shrinking by the day. I could hardly walk anymore and could barely drive my car. When I arrived at work, I had just a few stairs to climb, which had become nearly impossible. If I pulled with both arms on the rail, I could manage climbing one stair at a time. I could conduct 3 or 4 measures of a song at one time and had to switch arms to continue directing. Between classes, I had a student escort me to my office chair and then back to the conductor's stool at the start of the next hour. The first day I was able to lie down during my break and rest, but the next day I discovered I could no longer stand from a reclining position. Obviously, I was not in my normal, jovial, full-of-life mode, which was beginning to worry some of my fellow teachers. One dear friend came to me and suggested that I go see her internist immediately. I didn't have much use for doctors in those days, and I felt that any minute I would bounce back. However, the next day, feeling weaker, I got the number of her doctor and called. His receptionist said the doctor would be glad to see me the following Tuesday. I assured her that would be fine, but that they would have to send an ambulance for me because I would no longer be able to walk by then. After a few seconds of counsel with the doctor, she said, "Come in immediately." There were about a dozen steps to my apartment door. In order to get down to my car, I now had to sit down on the steps and lower myself step by step until I reached the ground level. I carefully walked to the car and drove to the doctor's building. Within a very few minutes, the doctor said, "I don't want to scare you, but I want you to go see a neurologist friend of mine in Chattanooga." I wasn't alarmed, but I told him I had to go home and get some things together, then drive up there. He strongly urged me to hurry, and if at all possible, get someone to drive me. I thought he was being a little overdramatic, but I went home and put a few personal items in a suitcase and started out the door. I suddenly realized there was no way I would be able to get me and my small suitcase down the staircase and into my car alone. I was just about to throw the suitcase down the stairs when a delivery man drove up to the little business next door. I asked if he would help with my bag while I slithered down the stairs. He could see my distress and offered additional help several times. I insisted that the situation was under control and thanked him for his assistance to the car. Although most of the strength was gone from my legs, I still had enough power to depress the clutch, brakes, and gas pedals in my wonderful little solid black 1959 Karmann Ghia. So off to Chattanooga I started. I was to meet the doctor at Memorial Hospital as soon as possible. The hospital was somewhere through the tunnels after Brainerd Road changed to McCauley, or something like that. You know how men are about directions. I had miscalculated just how close to empty my gas tank was by only a half gallon or so. The fact that the gas gauge had never worked in the Karmann Ghia had already caused a couple of difficult situations. About 20 miles north of Dalton, at exit 142, just as I passed the northbound exit ramp, I felt that special flutter. You know, the one when you run out of gas. If it had happened only 100 feet earlier, this story would have never been written. I coasted a few more feet, which took me across the overpass and about halfway past the merging on-ramp, which I could see off to my right. It was about 4 p.m. on that cold, overcast January day. The rain had stopped, but the pavement was still quite wet. I thought if I sat there a few minutes that the Georgia Highway Patrol would be along and lend assistance. After 15 or 20 minutes, I figured they must be busy with more important missions. My only apparent alternative was to somehow get down to the filling station and get some gas. It looked like 100 miles from my car to the station, which was really only a few hundred yards away. Traffic on I-75 was bumper to bumper and whizzing by in all three lanes at 70 miles an hour. It looked like the best path back to the station was to cross the grass toward the on-ramp, walk down the hill, and cross the 4 lanes to the little motel gas station restaurant. It was absolutely essential that I not lose my balance and fall, because I could no longer get up if I fell. My steps by this point were reduced to an approximate 6-inch stride, and my balance was not good. I managed to get across the grass and onto the shoulder of the ramp, where I carefully walked down the hill. There were not many cars on the cross street, so I managed to get across the 4 lanes okay. There was no gas can available at the store, so I borrowed an empty gallon-sized mayonnaise jar from the restaurant and some foil to cover the top. It was very difficult to get around the area due to some small sidewalks that I had to step up and down on. Finally, I pumped the jar about 3/4 full, and for the second time that day asked someone for a little help. I asked a man if he would give me a lift to my car at the top of the hill so I could get to Chattanooga. He said he was sorry, but he was heading south. The next fellow I asked was spending the night and didn't want to get back on the highway. There were a couple of more requests which were met by equally flimsy excuses. It looked as if I were going to have to take the glass jar in hand and walk back to my car. My mobility was more encumbered than ever. I had lost the balancing factor of my right arm because I had to carry the jar of gas. It was a little scary trying to cross that 4-lane road with a load of gas in hand. I was about halfway up the ramp when I realized how fast the human mind can calculate information. The inevitable happened. I lost my balance and began to fall. What was I to do? Should I throw the gas free so that I could brace my fall and not be injured? No, I had to have the gas to start the car. If I fell forward, the glass would break and saturate me with gasoline. 3/4 of the way to the ground, I decided to roll toward my back and support the gas the best I could so that it would not spill. I crashed down on my elbow, but was able to save most of the gas. Maybe 1/3 of it splashed on my brown plaid wool jacket. There I was, in that rustic jacket, lying on the side of the road, clutching a half-empty jug of amber-colored liquid. It's not difficult to imagine what motorists thought as they drove by. In retrospect, it remains hauntingly hilarious at my reaction to this rather serious situation. I gathered myself together and studied my options. Since I couldn't walk, I decided to scoot down the ramp about 40 feet on my rear end and hands and pull myself up using a highway sign for balance. As I started pulling up on the post, I suddenly realized there was a 30-foot drop just beyond the edge of the road. If I lost my balance, I figured they would not find my body until next spring. It was about this time I realized I was in a mess. I sat back down and leaned on my elbow with my jug nearby. The cars were coming up the ramp every minute or so, but none offered to assist. The sun was beginning to set, and I knew something was going to have to happen soon. I finally humbled myself enough to wave half-heartedly to the next driver to flag him down. Zoom and whoosh were all the attention I received from him. Another car approached, and I offered a more hearty wave. Still no response. For the next car, I tried a double-handed flag-down wave. The driver was at least kind enough to swerve in my direction. The next 2 drivers spit and shouted some American slang, respectively. Needless to say, my pride was quickly melting, and I knew I needed help immediately. After a few minutes, a car pulled up and stopped. An older lady rolled her window down about 2 inches and looked at me. Realizing her apprehensiveness, I spoke up and told her I was on my way to the hospital and had run out of gas. I pointed to my jar of gas and then to my car at the top of the hill and asked if her husband could help me. She explained that he had just gotten out of the hospital himself from back surgery and would not be able to lift anything. I told her if she would allow me, I would pull myself up on her car door, pick up my gasoline, and then, if her husband would drive very slowly, I would lean on the car for balance and walk back to my car. The couple agreed. I could not have been more thankful to the elderly couple even for this small blessing. I scooted over to the car and began to pull up with all of my remaining strength to stand. I was nearly to my feet when a white patrol car flew up the ramp, screeched to a halt, and 3 sheriff deputies jumped out of the car behind their doors with their guns leveled at me. Even I knew this was worse than before. They shouted something at me like, "Hold it," or "What's going on," or something. By that time, I was nearly to my feet, and I told one deputy that if he would let me lean on his shoulder, I would explain the situation. He saw that I was no threat, and they all holstered their guns. I kindly thanked the elderly couple, and they drove away. The deputies listened to my story, and then informed me why they were so abrupt in their response to my situation. There had been a murder several miles north of Chattanooga the day before, and the victim's body had been dumped at that exit right where I was. They were kind enough to take me up the hill and to pour the gas into my tank, and even raised the hood and got the car started. They wished me well and waved friendly as I drove off. I guess I should have asked them for a little more help. They did give me more detailed directions. They said that after Brainerd Road goes through the tunnels and becomes McCauley, turn right, and the hospital is back in that neighborhood. I didn't know there was a difference between Brainerd Road and East Brainerd Road. I stayed on I-75 North and took the East Brainerd Road exit, where I stopped and got a couple of dollars worth of gas. Let's face it, I was as lost as a human can get, so I stopped for more accurate directions to the hospital. By the time I arrived at Memorial Hospital, I was several hours later than expected. I left my car under the covered driveway and hobbled inside. I was nearly to the nurse's station when a rather large nurse said, "Oh, you must be Mr. Hammett." How flattering it was to be recognized in an unfamiliar city. I assured her I was Mr. Hammett. She said they had been expecting me for several hours. She asked me to be seated in the wheelchair and sign some forms, and they would get me right up to my room. I told her that my car was in the drive and that I had to get my suitcase and I'd be right back. With the force of an Army drill sergeant, she demanded that I be seated and that they would get my suitcase and park my car. I was in no shape to argue. After the required forms were signed, I was wheeled upstairs and taken into what I thought was a hospital ward with several patients scattered around the room. Once again, my pride was assailed, and I insisted that I had adequate insurance and that I wanted to have at least a semi-private room, not an open ward. For the second time in 6 hours, I heard the phrase, "I don't want to scare you, but..." The room into which I had been rolled was not a ward. It was the intensive care unit. They immediately hooked me up to a heart monitor, checked my breathing ability, took blood, and ran a series of tests. It was about that time that one of the doctors informed me that I could have stopped breathing at any point during the past several days. The doctor in Dalton knew what was wrong with me, but he wanted the doctors in Chattanooga to confirm it. I had contracted Guillain-Barré syndrome, a rare viral disorder which causes temporary paralyzation to one degree or another. It's one of those mysterious diseases whose cause and cure are not fully understood. I became ill and well with no help or hindrance from the physicians. The story would not be complete without a mention of my trip home from the hospital. My dear mother, Opal, had traveled to Chattanooga from her home in Montgomery to be with me and help as she could. I was far too weak and incapacitated to be able to drive my car. About all I could do was to get around the room with the use of a walker and to get to the bathroom and to fall exhaustedly back into bed. The doctors decided my condition had stabilized and released me from the hospital. My mother and grandfather had traveled together in her car from Montgomery. Grandpa Scott was to take Mom's car to my house, and she would drive my car. The only problem was that she had not driven a standard transmission car since 1940 and had hit a tree with that one. I told her if she would steer, work the brake, clutch, and gas, I would shift gears and coach her through what she needed to know. What a spirit that lady has. I don't know what influenced her to agree to such a foolish plan, but off we went. She cranked the car, and I shifted into reverse. More gas, release the clutch, a little more gas, now let off the gas, push in the clutch, now brake. We were now out of the parking space with only 35 miles to go. Can you imagine such a scenario of driving instructions through downtown, down I-75 and into Dalton? Well, as we say, she done good. We arrived in one piece and faced the task of getting my 95% paralyzed carcass up the flight of stairs and into my apartment. They managed to get me to the stairs where I sat down, then by pushing, pulling, and a lot of effort, we made it up to the apartment. I had remained in the hospital about 10 days and was subsequently out of work for about 6 weeks. I was desperately trying to recover because Robert Shaw was taking the symphony and chorus to Carnegie Hall for 3 performances of Brahms, Berlioz, and Verdi requiems. I simply could not miss that trip. To make that long story short, I recovered barely enough and just in time to make the trip, and it was wonderful. There is no other ancient event in my life about which I can remember so many details. There has never been an absolutely clear moral to the story, but I suspect I now possess a deeper sympathy and kinship for those with mobility difficulties. Surely there's a heightened compassion for those with aged steps. The old adage, "Things are not always as they appear," was driven home with emphasis. My friend David said, "The moral of this story is simple. Keep your gas tank full."